Give me a little check.
Check.
Okay, cool. Hello and welcome to Dirt Nap City. Again, we are back with another story about an interesting person who happens to be dead. This week, it's my turn to pick somebody out, and I've got somebody really awesome that Alex is going to just love once he knows who it is. But currently, he doesn't know who it is, even though you have it in the title and on the thumbnail. Alex does not know that because this all happens before the title and the thumbnail even exist. So, Alex, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Kelly. How are you?
Did you have a good Halloween?
I did not have a very eventful Halloween. We usually get about 7 trick-or-treaters. We maybe got about 20 this time, but they come. And then I had a big argument with my wife about when it's too old to trick-or-treat. I found the 8:45 people that are, 14, 15, 16, 18 years old, a little annoying. But she tells me they're just trying to stay children as long as they can, and we should embrace that. But honestly, I felt like I was being mugged.
So I guess you don't want to know that Jody and I went trick-or-treating last night together. The kids stayed home. They passed out candy while we trick-or-treated.
At least were you wearing costumes?
Yeah. I was the the weird neighbor, and she was the hot trophy wife.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you weren't wearing costumes.
we did it right. Well, we made it through October. It's now November, and a little bit of fall in the air. And today we have somebody that I think you're going to really enjoy learning about because he's a pretty amazing person. It is a guy. And I'm going to give you some clues, and I want you to feel free to guess as I give you these clues. So I'll start by telling you he was born in Pennsylvania in 1928. He was an actor, a writer, an author, and out of left field, he was a minister. Presbyterian minister.
Is that how I would know him?
No, most people, I didn't know he was a minister until recently, actually.
I would know him as an actor?
Yes, you would know him as an actor.
Did you say singer?
He was a musician, and he did sing, and he was an accomplished pianist. He had more than 40 honorary degrees from different colleges. He was, toward the end of his life, he was a favorite commencement speech giver. People loved to have him. I think he did over 150 commencement speeches in his career.
Is this Andrew Carnegie?
No. But interesting you said Carnegie because so many people say Carnegie.
Probably is Carnegie. When you said Pittsburgh, that's what I thought of. And when you said commencement speaker.
Yeah. No, he won a Lifetime Achievement Emmy in 1997.
When did he move to Dirt Nap City?
He moved there in 2003. His grandfather founded a brick company called the McFeely Brick Company in Latrobe, Pennsylvania.
I got it then. I got it.
All right.
That was the one that did it. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. friggin' Rogers. Yes. And did you know that his middle name was McFeely? Fred McFeely Rogers?
I didn't, but I remember I think it was the mailman. Was Mr.
Speedy
McFeely?
Delivery. Mr. McFeely, yeah. He was the guy that delivered the packages.
Well, I am excited about this because Mr. Rogers, I had a pretty strong relationship with when I was a kid. I mean, I watched Sesame Street, I watched Electric Company, I watched Zoom, but Mr. Rogers was the one that I actually really looked forward to. And when the book and documentary came out a few years back, I was really into that. I never saw the Tom Hanks movie, but the documentary I loved. So I'm really excited about hearing about this.
Here's an interesting fun fact. Tom Hanks is actually his 6th cousin. He's Mr. Rogers' 6th cousin. Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to hear about Fred Rogers.
Fred McFeely Rogers, born March 20th, 1928, passed away February 27th, 2003. He was, of course, a television host, author, producer, Presbyterian minister, And he was, of course, the one that created and ran Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from 1968 until 2001. It had a very, very long run. His grandfather, Fred Brooks McFeely, was the founder of a brick company in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and his father, James Hillis Rogers, was the president of that brick company. And his mother, Nancy Rogers, whose, of course, maiden name was McFeely, she was a volunteer at a hospital and actually knitted sweaters for American soldiers that were fighting in Europe at the time. And she also is the one who knitted all the sweaters that were on the show with him. Those were his mother's knitted sweaters that he would put on at the beginning. And he did have an adopted sister named Elaine. And yeah, as I said before, interestingly, he was the sixth cousin of Tom Hanks, who played Mr. Rogers in A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Which, have you seen that movie?
No, I just said I never saw that one. I'm trying to remember what sixth cousin means, though.
I think we're all kind of sixth cousins at some point. You know, it means you're sort of similar background, heritage. I don't know, but he actually did not have an easy childhood. He grew up shy, introverted, and he had asthma as a child. He was also bullied because he was overweight, and people called him Fat Freddy when he was young, and that was kind of a problem for him until he got into high school, where he sort of got out of his shell a little bit, became the editor of the yearbook, got involved in student council and National Honor Society and stuff like that. He was a very good student. He's the first non-troublemaker we've had.
Oh, wow.
Don't you think?
Well, we'll see. I mean,
so yeah, that's right. There's more onion to peel back. He went to school to get his music degree in 1951 from Rollins College in Florida. And while he was there, he met Sarah Joanne Bird, who was known as Joanne, and she and he married in 1952, and they were married until he died in 2003. And he had two sons named James and John. He graduated from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in 1962 and became a minister in 63. But prior to that, he had a couple of television shows that happened before his run with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which were one in Canada that was just called Mr. Rogers, and one on what was the pre-runner to PBS at the time. It was called The Children's Corner, and it was on WQED in Pittsburgh. And those were both sort of early models for what became Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But the Mr. Rogers Show, which actually took place on CBC, which is Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, was really where he formed the idea for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I mean, it was called Mr. Rogers, so he just added the name Neighborhood when he got onto PBS.
And what year was that?
That was in 1963.
When was he on? When did it get to PBS? When did it get to my TV? PBS. I'm not in Pittsburgh.
Oh, that was actually in 1968. So Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood premiered in 1968 on what would later become PBS. And in 1969, he actually testified before the U.S. Senate. Lyndon Johnson had proposed a $20 million budget for the creation of PBS, but when he left office, Nixon wanted to cut it to $10 million. And so Mr. Rogers was asked to come speak about why PBS was important, children's programming was important. And apparently he did such a great job that he had senators crying in the audience, and they approved a budget of $22 million. So he went $2 million above. And in 1970, Nixon actually appointed Rogers to the chair of the White House Conference on Children and Youth.
That testimony is a great YouTube video, by the way.
You can watch it. Yes, it's been viewed millions of times.
You can watch a condensed version of it where he just kind of cuts to the chase and talks about, and he really gets to the child in every one of those senators. It's a beautiful thing to watch, and something that I don't know if could happen today, where you could just melt somebody like that. But man, we miss Mr. Rogers
for sure. And again, sort of laying the foundation for what became PBS at the time. Because had the budget been cut, who knows what would have happened to it? Would it have survived? Because it's already kind of struggles, right? At least according to their fundraisers.
I used to always watch PBS during the pledge drive and be like, this is the greatest channel ever. But then let's face it, when it's not the pledge drive, it's not as good. The program is not as good.
Yeah, they really put their all-stars out for the pledge drives, right?
Yeah, for sure.
That sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
Some fun facts about Mr. Rogers. He was red-green colorblind. He was also a pescatarian. In 1970, he became one. And then after his father died, he became a vegetarian in the 1980s and said he couldn't eat anything that had a mother. That was sort of a famous quote of his. He was so much of a vegetarian that he co-owned the Vegetarian Times magazine. He became the co-owner in the mid-1980s.
He was an early adopter on vegetarianism. It wasn't as popular as it is today.
Especially among kind of older men, right?
And let's face it, back then, there probably wasn't a lot of, well, he probably didn't eat out a lot in restaurants, but it was probably a lot harder to do back then.
How about this? How about this fact? Mr. Rogers, you mentioned about going before a Senate committee, and could you do that today? Mr. Rogers was a registered Republican, but according to his wife, he was very independent in the way he voted. So he decided on the person, not on the party. And he didn't really like to talk about politics because he didn't want to appear biased in one direction or the other. So he also avoided speaking about faith on the air because he believed that he could be a better example by being an example versus preaching. He said teaching through example was as powerful or more powerful than preaching. And he said, you don't have to speak overtly about religion in order to get a message across. So, well, I think that's why a lot of people, did you know he was a minister?
I did know that. And it makes sense. It is a kind of a fountainhead of where a lot of his messages came from. But it's interesting to know he had formal teaching that way. I think a lot of people think he was a psychologist.
He did study early childhood development and education. So, he had both of those things going for him as far as how he related to children. Despite, his wealth later in life, he actually became more frugal and lived simpler later in life than he did earlier in life as he had more money. When he was doing Mr. Rogers, he answered all the letters himself. That was something he would write a response to everyone. When he became Mr. Rogers on PBS and got really popular, he had to actually stop doing that. But he had an assistant who would write responses, and then he would actually sign them. He would read them and sign them. So that was his signature. If you wrote to Mr. Rogers, you would get his autograph back.
Oh, nice.
He also, in addition to writing back all the letters, he swam daily at the Pittsburgh Athletic Association. And he woke up between 4:30 and 5:30 every morning to pray and read the Bible, prepare himself for the day. And then he went and swam after that. And he didn't smoke or drink. So probably because of his exercise and not smoking and drinking, he kept his weight at 143 pounds for most of his adult life, like pretty much always stayed around 143. And do you know what he said the significance of that number was?
143. No.
He said it means I love you, because I is one letter, love is 4 letters, and 3 is you. You is 3 letters.
So is it he loves himself?
I think he loved others more than he loved himself.
But what does that have to do with keeping trim?
Well, he kept his weight at 143 to prove that he loved himself and others. Yeah, you're right. That would kind of mean, he was keeping himself healthy, I guess. And big one here. This I'm a big fan of. He napped daily.
I'm a fan of that too.
He actually said, interestingly, in an interview on CNN, that he went into television because he hated it. He thought it was sensationalized and just really didn't like what was out there. I don't think he hated the medium. He hated the programming that was being done, and he wanted to improve on it. And he thought it would be a great way to get to children, to teach them things and entertain them at the same time.
I think that's why I got into podcasting. I don't like what's out there. And I feel like this is a way to teach, like, if you're a 6th grader, you got a term paper coming up on Mr. Rogers, this is the perfect way to meet that need.
Absolutely. I think that ultimately you have to embrace the things you hate, hug your haters, and make them better. And the things you hate to do. Those were just kind of some fun facts about him. He did develop another couple of programs later in life. One in 1978, he took a hiatus from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and wrote and produced a show called Old Friends, New Friends. And it was for adults, and it featured guests that he interviewed, and they included Hoagie Carmichael, Helen Hayes, Milton Berle, Lauren Hollander, Robert Frost's daughter, Leslie. I don't know what I'm the daughter of a famous poet. And Willie Stargell. You know
Willie Stargell, yeah.
Stargell
yeah,
is?
the Pittsburgh
Stargell.
famous Pittsburgh Pirate baseball player. Was that a local Pittsburgh show or was that a national show?
I don't know. That's a great question. I think it was probably national. I mean, he had star power at that time. And then he also visited Moscow and visited the set of a program called Good Night, Little Ones. That was a television show for children in Moscow, hosted by Tatiana Verdeneviva. I'm sure I'm butchering that, but pretty famous Moscow host of children's show over there. And then Tatiana came over and was on Mr. Rogers' show.
And that was Soviet. That was the Soviet Union. That's when nothing was getting through.
As a matter of fact, Mr. Rogers in 1987, when he was on Good Night, Little Ones, that appearance coincided with the meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev.
It wasn't much going on between the two countries. Every now and then, you'd see a rock band go to Russia. I think, didn't Billy Joel go over there? Well, today it's very common.
He also produced another program, bet you didn't know he had all these shows, called Fred Rogers Heroes, where he featured interviews and portraits of people across the United States who are having a positive impact on children and education.
Man.
So that was in 1994.
I didn't see that, but I wish I did now.
Well, I'm sure it's all available online. You could probably binge a whole lot of Fred Rogers, between the older shows and then the Old Friends, New Friends, Fred Rogers Heroes. There's a lot. The congressional testimony, all the interviews he did. Oh, and the only time he played a character that was not himself in a television show. Want to take a guess? It was in the 90s.
Was it WWE?
Oh, yes. He played Hulk Hogan's manager in WWE.
It wasn't a Duran Duran video or anything. No,
it wasn't Girls on Film. No,
I can't even imagine what it would have been. Was it a movie or a TV show?
TV show in the 90s.
Was it the $6 Million Man?
There's a lot of tie into that. It was actually an episode of Scooby-Doo where, no, it wasn't that either.
I almost believe that.
I know. That sounds actually pretty plausible. He appeared in Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman as a preacher.
Really?
In 1996, yes. And so, he had some really great quotes about life. And one of them was that when he was a boy, he would see scary things in the news. And this was the quote: "Look for helpers. You will always find people who are willing to help." That is also a quote from Albus Dumbledore, if you were a Harry Potter fan.
They ripped that off of Mr. Rogers?
I think it might have been inspired because that's what Albus Dumbledore says to Harry when he first comes to Hogwarts is help can always be found for those who need it.
Look for the helpers.
Kind of a paraphrase. Yeah. But
I love that.
But yeah, Mr. Rogers was an inspiration. Unfortunately, he died in 2003. He had stomach cancer, which is a little ironic because he was a vegetarian and kept in good health. But not everybody can escape cancer, unfortunately, and he was a victim of it at the age of 75, or actually 3 weeks short of his 75th birthday. Neither Matthew McConaughey nor Hulk Hogan spoke at his funeral, but violinist Itzhak Perlman and cellist Yo-Yo Ma both played, as did organist Alan Morrison. They all played in honor of Mr. Rogers. And then some famous people that were at his funeral were David Hartman, who was a Good Morning America host, And then the author of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Eric Carle, spoke.
That would have been one of the saddest funerals to go to, I think. Really. I mean, that
Yeah.
just, I wish they would have shown that on television. I would have definitely watched. What an influence he had on me and a lot of people from my generation. I mean, Evil Knievel did too, but this cut to our soul for our particular
Different
generation.
kind of influence, right?
Yeah, and I'm constantly wondering, what if he was around today? Could he change things? Could he make things more civil? And then I also wonder why there can't be. Why can't somebody fill that void? But nobody has yet.
Yeah, who would be the modern day Mr. Rogers? I'd nominate Dave Grohl, although he's a little rock and roll he's a grungier Mr. Rogers.
You're right, though. That's a really good. That's a really different kind of response, but I can't really argue with that. I mean,
yeah. I mean, you always see videos of Dave Grohl letting kids come up on stage and play with the band, right?
Nandi,
and giving just seems like a regular down to earth kind of guy, but probably eats meat and drops F-bombs occasionally,
Maybe. I mean, I know about the second part. I don't know if he eats meat.
Well, I'll give you a couple of more Mr. Rogers quotes that I think are pretty good. One of them is, "Feeling good about ourselves is essential in our being able to love others."
Love that.
You have to love yourself. I mean, I think the Biebs said that same thing.
Oh, that's true.
You gotta love yourself. Another one that is pretty good and would actually be really good for today is, "Forgiveness is a strange thing. It can sometimes be easier to forgive our enemies than our friends. It can be hardest to forgive the people we love. Like all of life's important coping skills, the ability to forgive and the capacity to let go of resentment may only take root when we love ourselves."
I love those messages. I just love those. And I think when we were kids, I think our teachers were actually also influenced by Mr. Rogers. When you think about it, if he was on TV in 1968, yeah, I probably started watching it in 1973, 1974, Yeah, I think at that time, kindness was something that was definitely needed when you think about things like integration and all the problems.
Vietnam.
Oh my gosh, they were Watergate, all these distrust, mistrust, all this turmoil that was going on in the country. It seemed like he came around at a perfect time for children of our generation.
One thing, speaking of integration, he did have a famous scene, and I forget the actor's name now. It's a famous person who is now in theater, but an African-American man. And he did a scene where he had his feet in a soaking tub with that man. The man was supposed to be a postman. No, a policeman, actually. He cast African-American man as a policeman in the 60s, which, to cast him as that was kind of going against the norms, going against the grain. And then there was a lot of controversy about integration of swimming pools at the time. And, some kids had bleach poured on them to get them out of black kids had bleach poured on them to get them out of a pool that was supposed to be for whites only. And his response was to share a little kind of baby pool foot soak with the policeman who was also African American, and he wasn't afraid of it. He just embraced it and said, here we are enjoying this together, two people, two friends, and that's actually in the movie that takes place in the Tom Hanks movie. But yeah, so many great things. And then, of course, that movie, I would recommend it because Tom Hanks does a good job of portraying him. And there are some moments in it that are supposed to be based on reality where he was on a bus or a train and everybody just spontaneously started singing, and he started singing too. And just this joy that he brought wherever he went.
I think the problem with that movie is it came out too close to the documentary, and the documentary was perfect. And for me, at least, I didn't then want to see a fake version of it. It was such a good movie. But yeah, I would definitely have run to that movie if it had come out independent of that doc.
What's interesting about it, if you're considering or on the fence about seeing it, it's actually not about Mr. Rogers. It's about the author. I don't know if he's New York Times or what magazine. It's the magazine author. It's
Esquire.
The story's really about him.
Yeah.
Esquire, yes, and he's supposed to just do a short little fluff piece about Mr. Rogers. Just go meet him one day and do this quick little interview and talk to him. And this is based on a true story. And then it turns out he gets to know Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers kind of gets under his skin, but in a way that makes him start to think about his own life and who he is, because this guy was known as writing really terrible things about people. He had a reputation for dragging people through the mud, and Mr. Rogers helped him to realize he could do better than that, and also to reconcile with his father and have a better relationship with his wife and his newborn son. And I mean, that's really, so if you go to see that movie, it's really good. It's a really great film. It's different than the documentary.
As you were talking about that, I was thinking, when you said that he was famous for digging up dirt, he probably went there thinking this guy is not as perfect as he seems. I'm sure that I'm gonna reveal that this guy's a fraud, which gets back to our question of why there are no Mr. Rogers today. I think because if there was, somebody would try to tear them down immediately. And because nobody is perfect, I think if Mr. Rogers existed in the age of Twitter, people would clown him for being corny. People would they'd make fun of the 143 thing.
You don't have a lot of faith in society there.
No, I mean, you say people called him Fat Freddy. Today, Twitter would probably they'd probably have pictures of him when he was a little kid. And then people would, hashtag Fat Freddy would probably trend for a little while and people would make fun of him. It's not about me not having faith in society. It's about when people get together, that's one of the first things they do is clown somebody who seems too good to be true, I just don't think in this time. I think he lived in his time, and he wouldn't fit in this time. But man, I wish he would.
Yeah, what would Margaret Green say about him?
Who's Margaret Green?
Oh, that senator.
Oh, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Oh yeah. That was the next thing I was going to ask you. Is that in the documentary, they run some clips from, I think, Fox News where people are saying about how Mr. Rogers ruined our generation and saying that people in Gen X are coddled, entitled brats who just want their self-esteem at all costs. And that's because, in fact, I think in one of the documentaries, they called Mr. Rogers the devil or something. They said he was an evil person for ruining our generation.
So, final thoughts on Mr. Rogers, at least from me, is that you're right. He was somebody that fit his time well, was needed during that time. I do think he's needed today, but I don't think his approach would work as well today. I think even young kids today are a lot more sort of jaded and sarcastic than they were back then. And unfortunately, they kind of grow up seeing more. They get older sooner these days. It seems like kids do, because they're exposed to more stuff that they would have been protected from back then. And so I don't know that his brand of communication and quietness and pure love would fly as well today as it would back then. But I do think that he, in a very positive way, impacted people like us. As we said, we've had a lot of troublemakers on this show. But I think, as much as Evel Knievel might have been an inspiration to people to go out and try to push themselves to do crazy stuff, Mr. Rogers was an inspiration to people to not be afraid to show love.
Yeah, and I don't know if you mentioned that. I think the last time I remember Mr. Rogers being out in the public was after 9/11. I think he actually had some sort of a special where he was interviewing helpers.
You're right. He did. Yeah. Yeah, I did see something about that.
Yeah, he was interviewing first responders after 9/11, and I remember at that time thinking, "Oh, there's an old, an old friend from the past." I wish this guy was still around more. I mean, he got older, he wasn't around. He got sick, but man, I wish somebody would fill that void, like I said before.
So I think I've told you this, but maybe I haven't. In probably 1998, 97, something like that, I used to work for a company, and one of the things we did, I worked for a staging audiovisual company, and one of our clients was PBS. And so we did several PBS meetings in various places, including Los Angeles, where they would do like roll out the new shows. And also in Phoenix, for some reason, they had several PBS things. They would do their fundraising, et cetera. And one of the speakers one year was Mr. Rogers. I was the technical director. I got to shake his hand, meet
Oh
him,
my gosh.
and have my picture taken with him, which it was really cool. First of all, he walked around every person on the crew during the rehearsals and introduced himself and asked what we did. And basically kind of like he got us behind schedule because he was just chatting everybody up and thanking everybody for their role. And then he sat down at the piano and played for us because he had to do a sound check anyway. And he said, "I'm going to dedicate this to the crew who's going to make me look great tomorrow." And he played the piano for a bit, and then let us all take pictures with him individually and as a group. And then he gave a great speech the next day. But that was a pretty cool thing to get to meet him. Yeah.
It reminds me of what they say about Paul McCartney, that he is aware that whenever he meets somebody, it's the greatest day of their life. And he's
gracious.
But yeah, very gracious, and but also keenly aware that people are expecting a certain thing from him, and he can't disappoint them.
Well, Mr. Rogers was one of a kind, and I'd love to hear what other people think about Mr. Fred McFeely Rogers, and we really appreciate you tuning in. We got more shows coming up, and we'll see you next time on Dirt Nap City.